Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. Today we have with us Tim Sprankle, Senior Pastor at the Leesburg Grace Brethren Church, and we're going to have a little dialogue about a paper that he presented. But first, I thought, Tim, would you give us a little introduction about yourself, your ministry experience, where you went to school, and whatnot?
Yeah, thanks, Herb. I've been in ministry at Leesburg Grace Brethren Church for the last 7 years. Prior to that, I was in a house church ministry for 4 years. Spent 2 years in Denver, spent 2 years in Arizona, and prior to that, my wife and I, she helped me get through seminary, went to Grace Theological Seminary, and Grace College before that. I was a biblical studies major with dabbling in Greek and Hebrew and exegesis and some of those things.
Okay. Well, let's transition and talk a little bit about this paper you presented. My understanding is that you went to the Midwest Regional Conference for the Evangelical Theological Society, and you presented a paper there to a group of students, faculty, scholars, and pastors that were attending that conference. Can you give us the title of your paper, thesis, and just an overall summary of what the paper contained?
Yeah, the paper title was The Inconspicuous Adam, and the subtitle was The Disappearing Act of Adam and Its Meaning for Biblical Scholarship, or more specifically, Why the First Adam Fades from Israel's History and what that means for modern debate. And really what I wanted to do was figure out why Adam, after Genesis chapter 5, disappeared. And then in the New Testament, he reappears. His namesake is given several times. I thought that was kind of interesting that he dropped out and then reappeared because the Old Testament does a lot of self-referencing.
So in other words, he's mentioned in Genesis, not mentioned anywhere else in the Old Testament, but then reappears in the New Testament.
Yeah, there's one other location in the Old Testament. When the Chronicles give their genealogy, his name appears as the first.
Okay.
And then silent again on Adam. Now, for a book like the Old Testament that refers to itself so often, I thought this was kind of curious because I started paying attention to years ago some of these Old Testament psalms or stories where Israel retold where she came from, how God had saved her out of Exodus, how God had delivered her through the Red Sea. And then several of the people who were heroes in Israel's past were named, even the creation accounts were listed at times in the Psalms, but no other reference to Adam. And I thought, that's kind of strange. And then I started hearing about this historical Adam debate, and I thought, I should probably do some more research on that and try to figure out what's going on there.
Okay, well, let me pause for a minute before you move on. What's this historical Adam debate that you just referenced?
Yeah, well, about 2011, Christianity Today came out with a feature article about the historical Adam and the debate that's surrounding that. And then just last year, Zondervan came out with a book called The Four Views of the Historical Adam. Okay. And obviously the reason that this is becoming more of a popular debate is because it's people looking at scientific evidence and looking at their understanding of the Bible and how do these two topics come together. And so it's trying to mesh scientific understanding with biblical understanding, and the question is, were Adam and Eve real, actual, historical people? Okay. The approach to my paper was a little bit different, though, and the conclusion of my paper was that that's the wrong question anyway.
Okay, so what would be, from your perspective, and as you worked your way through your paper, what was the question then that you were answering?
Yeah, well, what I noticed was after Adam's disappearing act in the Old Testament, you find his namesake and the story of him falling in the garden with Eve. Some just references, some creative retellings of that. They crop up all over the place in the Second Temple literature and a little bit beyond. And specifically 200 BC, even after the New Testament period was written, we have all these retellings of the life of Adam and Eve. Okay. And he became a really popular figure all of a sudden.
So when you think about these writings, these Second Temple writings that are non-biblical, can you name a few and then explain some of the...
Yeah, some of the ones where his name shows up. In the Apocrypha, you have the Song of Solomon, and he becomes a hero in Israel's past. They go through many of ancient Israel's heroes. Adam's not mentioned at first in the list. And then as the list comes to a close and you think, certainly no Adam, all of a sudden at the very end it says, and there was Adam, who was the greatest of all the heroes. He was above all. So here you have an ancient Jewish document that looks very highly at Adam. Then you have, so that was actually in Syriac, and then we have We also have in Wisdom of Solomon, his name shows up. We have him listed in Jubilees, in 2nd Baruch, in 4th Ezra. We have him listed in some of the rabbinical scrolls. There's one called Genesis Rabbah 14:6. So that's just a sampling. Some of the Dead Sea Scrolls mention him too, the community scroll. And so all of a sudden, Adam becomes a much more popular name to drop in this period of literature.
Okay. So Genesis, Chronicles, he's mentioned, silence. We move into this Second Temple period in this non-biblical language or literature where he's comes up again, and then he reappears in the New Testament.
Yeah.
So it seems like you're tracing a trajectory of this Adam figure through Jewish literature, biblical and non-biblical. So what do you find in the New Testament, and then what ends up being some of your conclusions?
Yeah. Well, in the New Testament, obviously you have two key references that Paul gives as he's talking about salvation and Jesus being the second Adam. That's in Romans chapter 5, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Those are pivotal texts when Paul's talking about Jesus bringing forth new creation. The old creation is surrendered to death and curse. And a lot of the old intertestamental authors, the Second Temple literature authors, they talk about Adam bringing death and curse, but not all of them do. So what Adam does, or what Paul does, is he pulls out one strain of Jewish thought out of several strains of Jewish thought and how they go about understanding Adam. Some people viewed him as a hero, as honorable, as the blessed one. And then other people say, he's the one who brought sin and curse on our life. And that's what Paul does. We have other references to Adam, too, in 1 Timothy chapter 2 as well. I didn't deal with that as much.
Okay.
Yeah.
So your bottom line conclusion as you think your way through what your initial question was and what was your final answer, could you state that for us?
Well, what I wanted to find out, first of all, was why did the Old Testament grow silent?
Okay.
And that's almost an impossible question to answer. I didn't know if it was shame, if they forgot Adam, if they wanted to bury him. But they weren't afraid to talk about him during that Second Temple period. And then in the New Testament, they were not afraid to address him. In fact, I think that Adam was probably on their mind far more often than the Old Testament refers to him. Mm-hmm. So the conclusion I came to was that sure, Adam's name disappears, but Adam was on every page of the Old Testament and New Testament story because it's a story that's filled with sin and with death. And if we spend all our time trying to figure out this historical Adam and DNA and biology and trying to figure out how does this line up with science, we're going to get caught up in a debate that the Bible is not trying to address. The Bible is dealing with ancient literature and their understanding of history, not our understanding of science. And I think that's important to understand for this debate nowadays as we approach the text.
So this comes up to the next question I was thinking, why did you write on this issue? Is this now you did mention a book apparently that has come out. Is that the reason? Was this book prompting you to write this? And we'll come back to the book later on.
Sure.
But did the book prompt you, or is there something going on in your congregation or within our society that you're aware of? What prompted you to write on this issue?
Honestly, there are probably three reasons.
Okay.
I still read the Bible not just as a pastor. I read the Bible as a student of the text, and I want to pay attention to questions that I have, and I want to address them. And so as I was reading through and noticing this absence, it was a question that bothered me. Okay. And I want to model a learner's attitude for people in my church. So that's the first reason. Second reason, I notice a lot of times with students, high school students who are in the public school system, they'll talk about creation evolution with their friends on a regular basis. And the question I've been asked several times is, can you be an evolutionist and a Christian? And that's a real question that not only young people are asking, but then when they get to college and a lot of their origin beliefs are challenged, some people walk away from the faith. Mm-hmm. I feel like after doing this study, and I probably leaned this way before, I think that the mechanics of how God created weren't as important as the fact that God created in the Old Testament. And so there are probably inherent problems with a theistic evolutionary model, but I think there's inherent problems in a 7-day literal creation model too. And so I'm thankful going through this study that I can confidently say to my students, you can be a Christian and still have this view of how the world came about, or this view on Adam. I think it lends grace to students, but I'd also walk them through, so here's some of the challenges, either direction. So it helps me interact with people with those kind of questions. And the third reason, and it kind of goes along with the first one about wanting to model learning for my congregation, but as time goes on, these kind of questions will come up more and more. Voices like Ken Ham and Bill Nye will continue to get louder. I want to be able to give a reasoned response to people in my church, whether it's this issue or something else. And so I pushed myself to work on this sort of paper because it will help me give a reasoned answer to people who are asking, how do you respond to this debate? And I wanted to be able to do that for my congregation as well.
Okay. So as I think about your paper, and of course we're going to post this on the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. It'll be a free download for those who might like to read it over. But a question I have is, well, how might other pastors perhaps benefit from your paper if they were to download it and read it? What would be one of the benefits?
Yeah, I think the charts that I provided in there are helpful. The charts help you look at the name Adam as it appears in Genesis, and just being able to look at that in a chart format is helpful. I also look at the way that the primeval history in the Old Testament, Genesis 1 through 11, is brought back up in the New Testament, and then some of the credos or the ways that the Old Testament refers to itself. I have a chart on those too. I think that's helpful material just to help people think through these themes. And then for anyone who's not going to take the time to look through the Second Temple literature, I have a chart and then several really interesting quotes that refer to the life of Adam that people probably are not going to dig up on their own. So what I've done there is I've synthesized some other people's research, some actual source material, and instead of them going and reading an entire book on it, I can summarize the argument for them in a couple pages.
So then you've consolidated a lot of information in 2 or 3 charts that somebody could go download the article, they can read the article, but the charts will actually focus attention on things very quickly.
Yeah.
Very good.
And then one other thing is there are a whole lot of books or articles that are listed in the footnotes. So if anyone wants to jump into this particular discussion and take it farther than the book I'm about to mention when you ask me about it, they can find other source materials there that they can look up.
Well, let's talk about that other book. I mean, what would be a good book that might give them an overview of the issues, and what would you recommend beyond what's going to be in your footnotes?
Yeah. Well, this is in the footnotes, but this is the Historical Adam book. It's 4 views on the historical Adam. I found this to be really helpful. It looks at a theistic evolutionist and his view, an archetypal view of Adam, not necessarily being a historical Adam, but he's an archetype. And then there's a hybrid view in there by John Collins, and then the last one is more of your literal interpretation of a historical Adam from something like the creation, the Answers in Genesis group.
Okay.
So gets all of the views. I also found this one to be helpful. Peter Enns' book, The Evolution of Adam. Enns has not always been the most kindly reviewed author, but he does a really good job of looking at this debate from a different perspective. So his different perspective and his appeal to some of the Second Temple literature was helpful.
Okay. Well, Tim, thank you so very much for sharing with you your paper. For those of you who are watching and would like to receive a download of the paper, it will be posted on the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies webpage under the free downloads section under Tim Sprankle. Thank you very much.